On November 29th, 1970, a father and his two young daughters were hiking through a valley outside Bergen, Norway. They were in a place locals had nicknamed Death Valley long before this day for a string of unexplained deaths that had happened there over the centuries. They found the partially burned body of a woman lying among the rocks. By the time Norwegian police finished working this case, they'd have 8 different names for her, none of them real, a coded notebook nobody could read, sanded off fingerprints, and a trail of hotel stays across the entire country. More than 50 years later, nobody has ever figured out who she actually was. This is the Isdal woman. Follow me down. Welcome back to the Follow Me Down podcast. This is your host, Nightmare Jazz, and on this podcast, we talk about the creepy, the unknown, the weird. I still haven't figured out a good intro for this podcast yet. As you can tell, I'm just saying words, but I think you get the gist of it. Make sure you're subscribed to the pod. I release videos every single day right now because I'm a crazy woman. And yeah, this is the Isdal woman. I hope you enjoy this one. Let's get started. The valley is called Isdalen, Ice Valley in Norwegian, and it sits in the foothills below Ulriken Mountain, the tallest of the 7 mountains surrounding Bergen. It's remote and rocky, the kind of terrain locals avoid without a specific reason to be there. The father and his daughters were hiking through it that Sunday morning when the smell hit them first, before they saw anything. What they eventually found was a woman's body, badly burned, positioned among the rocks that were also scorched black. She was lying on her back with her arms raised, a posture forensic investigators immediately recognize as a pugilistic pose, a specific muscle contraction pattern that happens when a body is exposed to extreme heat, not something that indicates how she was actually positioned before the fire. Scattered around her were sleeping pills, an empty bottle of liquor, a pair of rubber boots, and a mostly melted plastic water container that had likely held fuel. The scene looked, on its surface, like it could have been a suicide. It just kept getting stranger the longer investigators looked at it. Police estimated she was between 25 and 40 years old, roughly 5'4", with dark brown hair and delicate rounded features. I mean, that description was frustratingly generic, and it turned out that was likely the point. Every single clothing label on her body and in her belongings had deliberately been cut out. Not torn off in a fire, cut out, individually, item by item, before she ever came to this valley. Her fingerprints had been sanded down, scraped away to the point where getting a usable print off her body was nearly impossible. No passport was ever found on her, only the remains of what investigators believed was a plastic passport cover, mostly melted, found near the body. Whoever this woman was, she had spent real time and effort making sure that if she died, no one would be able to trace her back to anyone. Police put her description out publicly, and the tips started coming in almost immediately, but not from family or friends looking for a missing woman. They came from hotel staff. Hotel Hordeheimen in Bergen reported that a woman matching her description had stayed there on November 23rd, just 6 days before her body was found. A shoe store employee and scavenger remembered selling her a pair of rubber boots, identical to the ones found at the scene, and specifically remembered 2 details: that she had an unplaceable foreign accent, and that she strangely smelled of garlic. Waitresses at another hotel remembered her dining beside German Navy personnel, including at least one officer. As investigators pulled the thread further, they found she had checked into hotels across multiple Norwegian cities, going back to March of 1970, roughly 8 months before her death. every single time she used a different name. Fenella Lorque, Genevieve Lanciere, Claudia Tielt, Claudia Nielsen, Alexia Zarna Merches, Vera Jarl, Elizabeth Lienhofer. Okay, yeah, Lienhofer, I think. At least 8 separate aliases, each attached to a different invented background. Sometimes she was Belgian, sometimes French, sometimes South African. She'd have needed forged passports to check in under any of these, since hotels in Norway required identification, but no passports of any kind were ever recovered. Hotel staff who remembered her described a consistent pattern of behavior that went far beyond ordinary caution. She paid exclusively in cash. She frequently requested to change rooms, specifically asking for ones with a clear sightline to the entrance or the parking lot. After meals, staff recalled her wiping down glasses and utensils, removing her own fingerprints from surfaces she touched. She spoke French, German, and broken English, possibly Flemish as well, always with an accent nobody could quite pin down to one country. About a week after her body was found, a station attendant at the Bergen train station called the police. 2 pieces of luggage had been sitting left in the luggage lockers unclaimed for over a week, and once he heard about the ongoing investigation, he put 2 and 2 together. Inside, police found wigs and additional disguise items. They found a tube of eczema cream sold, at the time, exclusively in Belgium. One of the few concrete geographic breadcrumbs and they found a pair of sunglasses. An officer going through the bag held them up to the light and spotted a partial fingerprint pressed into the lens, one that would go on to be matched against prints lifted from the body, confirming that the luggage belonged to her. They also found a notebook filled with what looked like a private code. Not a language anyone recognized, just structured, deliberate marks that clearly meant something to the person who'd written them. Police sent it to a military code specialist for analysis. The notebook eventually got at least partially deciphered, and what it turned out to contain was a coded log of her own movements. Dates, cities, hotel names, encoded but structured in a way that matched almost exactly with a pattern of aliases and hotel stays investigators had already independently traced through witness tips. She had been keeping a private record of her own trail, and a code specifically built that if someone else found it, they couldn't read it without already knowing the system. That's a genuinely unusual habit for an ordinary person to have. It's a fairly specific habit for someone trained in tradecraft, the kind of operational security methods used by intelligence operatives. Nobody ever came forward to claim her. No family, no friend, no employer, nothing. Bergen authorities ended up funding a public funeral for her out of the city and police funds since there was no one else to do it. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the Mollendal Cemetery in Bergen, under no name at all, because there wasn't one to put on the stone. In early 1971, just a few weeks after the body was discovered, Norwegian authorities officially closed the case, ruling her death was most likely a suicide. The sleeping pills, the fuel container, the isolated location all fit that conclusion on paper. But the ruling never sat right with a lot of people close to the investigation, and it still doesn't sit right with most people who've studied the case since. Autopsy findings showed a combination of carbon monoxide exposure and a barbiturate overdose, consistent with phenamol, a sedative. But investigators also noted the lack of significant soot deep in her airway, the kind of detail that raises a real question about whether she was already dead or unconscious before the fire started around her, rather than dying from the fire itself. Bruising on her body raised additional questions nobody was ever able to fully resolve. The lead investigator at the time, Oscar Hordness, was pushed repeatedly on the espionage angle and stated publicly he believed it could be ruled out with certainty. Plenty of people working the case and plenty more since have never agreed with that assessment. Okay, obviously, this chick sounds like a freaking spy. So here's a contest that makes the espionage theory more than just an internet speculation. Bergen was, and still is, home to one of Norway's largest naval bases. Norway shares roughly 200 kilometers of border with the Soviet Union above the Arctic Circle, while remaining firmly allied with NATO and the United States. Soviet submarines were regularly spotted in Norwegian fjords throughout this period. NATO naval exercises involving American, German, and British ships were a common occurrence on this coastline. And specifically starting in the 1960s, Norway had been developing something called the Penguin Missile System, funded jointly with the US Navy in West Germany, a project that would eventually become NATO's first operational naval strike missile when it entered service in 1972. Testing for that system was happening in exactly the region and exactly the time frame that the Isdal woman was traveling through, including Stavanger, one of the cities she'd stayed in under a false name. The pattern fits a certain profile uncomfortably well. Multiple false identities, forged documents, a private coded log of her own movements, counter-surveillance habits like requesting specific hotel rooms, wiping down her own fingerprints, dining with German naval officers. No identifiable, legitimate source of income to explain how she was funding months of travel across an entire country. Now, none of that alone proves espionage. Together, it's exactly the shape investigators would expect from an intelligence operative working under deep cover during an active Cold War. Not everyone buys the spy theory, but it's worth being fair to the other side of it. Some investigators and researchers have pushed a mental illness explanation, instead arguing that everything read as tradecraft could also describe a woman in the grip of paranoid delusions. Changing hotel rooms repeatedly, wearing wigs, using false names, and keeping a private coded record of her own movements. All of that could theoretically be a person spiraling, not a person on a mission. The fentanyl found in her system is a sedative that's historically been prescribed for seizure disorders, which raises the possibility that she had an undisclosed medical condition contributing to her erratic behavior. But the problem with the mental illness theory is that it doesn't explain everything else. It doesn't explain who was funding the months of travel with no visible income source. It doesn't explain the witnesses who described her meeting with unidentified men, including one account near Quayside, where she was reportedly seen with a man in a naval uniform. It doesn't explain why her travels specifically clustered around active NATO missile testing sites and timelines. I mean, it's not random. It doesn't seem random anyway. A person suffering paranoid delusions doesn't typically also happen to be independently timing their own movements around classified weapons testing. For decades, the case sat mostly dormant, kept alive by Norwegian true crime writers and a growing online community rather than active police work. That changed in 2016 when journalists from NRK, Norway's national broadcaster, began a serious year-long investigation into the case, working directly with Kripos, Norway's National Criminal Investigation Service. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place. The NRK team discovered that the Isdal woman's jaw had been preserved in a federal archive for decades, giving modern investigators physical material to work with that hadn't been available to the original 1970 team. Using isotope analysis on her teeth, a technique that measures specific chemical signatures absorbed into tooth enamel based on the water and food that a person consumed while their teeth were forming. Forensic scientists were able to narrow down the region that she likely grew up. And the results pointed to an area along the French-German border, with some analysis specifically flagging the region around Nuremberg. A scientist at Kripos involved in that testing said the results were, in her words, more specific than she could have ever dreamed of. DNA testing was also performed on the preserved remains. As of the most recent reporting on the case, that DNA has not returned a match in any database, meaning that even with a physical genetic sample in hand, nobody with a matching profile has ever been found or come forward. The Isdal woman remains, to this day, unidentified. Her case is considered one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in Norwegian history. And the strangeness of the physical evidence, the sanded fingerprints, the 8 aliases, the coded notebook, the missing passport, the timing around classified missile testing has kept it from fading the way most 50-year-old cold cases eventually do. Somewhere there may still be a family member who never learned what happened to a relative who just simply stopped writing home in the late 1970s. Or there may be an intelligence file sealed in an archive somewhere in Europe that already has her real name written on it. Either way, the woman buried in an unmarked grave in Bergen went to extraordinary lengths in life to disappear completely. More than 50 years later, she still has. I would really love to hear what you guys think down below. I think she was a spy. That's just my personal opinion. It's too weird. Nah, I think she was a spy. Yeah, it was a Cold War. What do you do? All right, tell me how you feel in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and remember that mommy loves you. Good night, my precious.